All right. Welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your boy, your favorite conservative. All right. Welcome back to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your boy, Jeff Charles, your favorite conservatarian. And I've got another fire guest for you guys today. This one is going to be quite enlightening, especially since it involves something that happened in a different country, in our neighbor to the north, Canada. As we go through this conversation, you're going to see a lot of this applies to what we're going through down here in America. So definitely going to be very excited about that. But before I go into all that, please like, share, and subscribe to this video. Like, share, and subscribe. Click. It only takes a few clicks, less than 5 seconds, to like, share, and subscribe. That helps me out immensely. Also, if you want to support my work, I've got links to that in the show notes below. So go ahead and check that out. And before I get into everything, I just want to remind you that Liberty Nation is a proud sponsor of A Fresh Perspective. Check out libertynation.com for all of your conservatarian news, original articles and analysis, videos, podcasts, Liberty Nation Radio, and their signature TV program, The Conservative Five, all on libertynation.com, where truth is making a comeback. Now, without further ado, I would like to bring on my guest. He is a radio talk show host. He's a writer for Substack. Go ahead and check that out. We'll have links to that in the show notes. But I wanted to introduce you to Jamil Jivani, a good friend of mine that we've gotten to know each other over the past couple of years or so. And he has quite a story to tell. But first, welcome to the program, Jamil.
Jeff, awesome to be with you, man.
Yeah, glad to have you. It's interesting talking to you face to face because I'm used to talking to you over the phone.
I know, yeah, it is an adjustment, but you have a wonderful face to look at, so I appreciate the change.
All right. My face isn't made for radio. I suppose.
Yes, it is YouTube friendly.
Yes. So before we get into everything and before we get into your story, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and all that good stuff?
Yeah, I have a background that I think is quite similar to a lot of Americans who grow up facing different kinds of inequality. You know, I was raised by a single mom in the suburbs of Toronto. My mother is a Canadian. My father was an immigrant to Canada from Kenya. So I have a similar sort of ancestral background as your former president, Barack Obama. And, growing up like many young men do, especially young Black men without a father in the home, it presents a number of economic, social, cultural challenges. And I think those challenges pretty much defined my childhood in many ways. I often tell people that I grew up searching for a father figure, and that search led me to some not so great places and some positive places. I was struggled a lot as a student. I was declared illiterate when I was a high school student, 15, 16 years old. And by the grace of God, I made my way out of high school and found some positive mentors later on in life. And they really helped kind of change the trajectory of my life. I went to community college, university, and then wound up at Yale Law School in New Haven, Connecticut. So I did wind up living in the U.S. for quite some time. Also spent some time working for Cory Booker in Newark, New Jersey when I was a law student. And and then actually, also
this would have been back when Cory Booker was a more sensible Democrat. And I don't know what happened to him. I still have a level of respect for him, but I mean, back in the day when he was mayor and I heard about him, I was like, okay, I can respect this dude.
Yeah, at that point when I worked for him, so we're talking summer of 2011 was when I was an intern in his administration, and that was a time where he was really, taking on the old civil rights guard, bringing new ideas to the forefront that might help, urban America. It was very inspiring for me as a kid who grew up in Toronto to see a Black man where we don't have the same history of Black political leadership in Canada. It's a more new thing here because our population is smaller. So seeing, Black politicians, Black leaders rise up in the United States was very inspiring to me and my friends, my peer group in Canada. And he was, bringing charter schools and talking a lot about school choices, the new civil rights issue. I mean, that was a different time in Cory Booker's career. Certainly he's changed quite a bit since then. But he was also at a time where he was really like in the conversation about policing, where now I think it's become quite polarized between you either think the police have no positive social value or you know sort of run interference for bad policing. He was a guy who was in the middle of that, right? Who was saying like we need good policing, we need ethical law enforcement, but we also need to be acknowledging where police make mistakes or abuse their power. So that version of Cory Booker was the kind of guy that I think would be making a lot of positive moves today. Unfortunately, he's not around anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I remember him even talking about being tough on crime and also the corruption that he had to fight against to even get elected. I mean, when Sharp James was mayor, he had to push back against that establishment and that machine. And I watched a documentary about his fight to become mayor. And I was like, man, I probably don't agree with this guy on much when it comes to politics, but I admire the hell out of him. I know we do have Black Democrats that are like that. I just wish we had more because we're seeing this change where people are trying to pull the party in a more progressive direction. And we've already seen, like with defund the police and stuff like that, that those policies do not help Black people. They hurt Black people. And I can only imagine what goes on up in Canada.
Well, and that's one of the things that was like exciting about, coming to the US for law school for me, right? Like, because the United States has produced many stories. I mean, not as many as we like, but many compared to other countries like my own, where you could have a kid born in a single parent household and, achieve something. Like that is something that is very uniquely American. And I was so happy to get the chance to, move to the US, complete my education. And it was people like him that at the time provided a role model of what Black political leadership might look like. And I think you're right that unfortunately it's being presented a bit like a generational issue now, right? Like they're acting like that type of Black Democrat is sort of the past, and the future of Black democratic politics is far more left wing. And I don't think that necessarily has to be the case, but that is the version of history that I think they want to write.
Yeah, and that's actually going to lead us into your story, actually, because I want to kind of mix that in because when you first told me about it, I'm like thinking, how does this compare to how it goes on in America? And I'll give my thoughts on that in a second. But why don't you kind of start from the beginning? I mean, you worked for iHeartRadio, Bell Media in Canada. Tell us about that whole. Just give us the rundown from the beginning.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I went to law school. So I'm not a person who thought I'd ever have a radio show. I didn't intend to get into the media. But, I started doing more media, frankly, after seeing Black Lives Matter rise to greater prominence in 2020. And there were things that were starting to bother me, right? Like when they burned down that church in DC, for example, or things that I just started to feel were not the Black police officer who was killed in St. Louis, just things that started to feel like this movement is not representing the priorities of Black communities. And I felt the need to start speaking to that. And so I took an opportunity to do a radio show. Now, iHeartRadio is a brand probably many of your listeners in the United States would recognize. They also do business in Canada through a partnership with a company called Bell Media, which is the biggest media company in our country. And so they hired me to do a daily radio show, which Jeff, you were a guest on many times, in Canada after George Floyd was killed. And I think they realized, okay, they were looking for Black on-air talent. There's not very many Black people who do media work in Canada. So I was on a short list, I think, of people who could, do a show. And so they basically hired me to do it. Now, what I don't think they appreciated was that just because a Black person is being hired doesn't mean that you can predict all of his or her opinions on every political issue that may arise. So what I think they were trying to do was sort of check a box, like, okay, now we've got a Black person on our payroll, but I don't think they really looked into what my views are, or perhaps my opinions, or frankly, how conservative I might be on certain issues. And so pretty quickly after I got hired, I could see that this exercise of checking a box wasn't going to be as simple as they thought it was going to be. And I started to experience some resistance, like ruffling some feathers where my opinions maybe didn't line up with what they thought. And I think this gets to your point earlier about the changes in democratic politics as well, because I do think my age played a role in this. I'm 34, and I think they thought they were getting a young, progressive, liberal black guy who would be sort of a mouthpiece for their diversity and inclusion agenda, and not realizing that just because I'm black and I'm young and I have a background that would indicate perhaps to them that I'd be a liberal doesn't mean they can that's going to be how I come at every issue. And especially when it came to race, because my view on this, and I think you're one of the few people who I would say has a nuanced view on racial politics that I actually learn a lot from, and I really appreciate your perspective on these things. And I would say my view is not very not dissimilar to yours, right? I mean, I recognize that inequality is a real problem. I recognize that there is a historical impact of how past policies and current policies impact Black families. But I also don't think the solution to that is talking about the government and, frankly, liberal saviors coming in and fixing things for our communities. And
Right.
so there's this worldview coming out of the tragic killing of George Floyd that was starting to really put, I think, a liberal framework on every solution to the problems that face our communities. And they wanted, I think, a radio host to talk about that, and I wasn't willing to do so. So, over time, that produced enough conflict that eventually they fired me. And I'm happy to get into some of the specifics of like how that actually took place. But I think the key issue for me was that they tried to use me, right? And that was something that I was really uncomfortable with. And I think many Black people, regardless of where we fall in the political spectrum, have a real discomfort with tokenism. And that's what I felt was going on, right? That as soon as I became politically inconvenient, they wanted to get rid of me, and in fact lied about the reasons why they fired me in the process.
Yeah, so why don't you? So I want to stay in this part of your career where you're still doing the radio show, but you're getting some pushback. Can you describe to me the type of pushback you were getting? Like, were there specific things that you would talk about, or specific opinions, or how would they come at you with this?
Yeah, so a few things would happen. So I'll give you some examples. One of the big ones happened around our Independence Day, which is July 1st, just a few days before you guys celebrate July 4th, right? And they wanted literally the day before our Independence Day for us to do our entire show, not just my show, every show in the iHeartRadio talk network in Canada was supposed to air commentary mostly from left-wing activists decrying our country as racist. Mm-hmm. And they picked it to happen the day before our Independence Day because this is part of the sort of liberal worldview that you cannot celebrate your country, that you must define your country by the worst historical injustices. And in my view,
that progressives ruin everything.
Yeah. Now, and this was a debate happening in the United States too around Juneteenth, right? That somehow acknowledging Juneteenth would be, tarnishing Independence Day. And I can appreciate different perspectives on that, but I felt that doing it the day before our Independence Day and doing it in such a controlled fashion, where literally they produced content and wanted to force every radio host to play it on their respective shows. I was able to get out of that basically because of my time slot and perhaps also because of my unwillingness to comply. And I could start to feel that, those tensions emerge because I wasn't being a team player on their political messaging. So that would be one example. Another example would be for employees, they introduced what they called equity consultations. And Jeff, it was about as ridiculous as you could imagine because they would have dates and times for every kind of identity you could imagine. Non-racialized men, racialized women, LGBT, all these different segmentations of the workforce. And I sent them an email and I said, listen, I think that you need to focus on diversity of thought and opinion, because what we're having in our workplace is people who look different, but all think the exact same. And as a media company, that is concerning. Well, as you could imagine, I never got a response to my concerns about diversity of opinion, right? So these are the sorts of things that were happening. Ultimately, by the end of my time there, so about a year and a half after George Floyd was tragically killed, and they wind up dismissing me, I started to get emails, literally, and I'm shocked to this day that they put this stuff in writing, because this is actually what gives me the legal protection to talk about this, and they can't sue me, they can't touch me, because I have in writing them saying to me that they question my commitment to diversity and inclusion as one of their only Black employees, because I was not parroting their views on things like vaccine mandates or on gender ideology. So, for example, I was very positive toward Dave Chappelle when he got into his big cancel culture issue in the fall. And and in my view, what Dave Chappelle was raising was not some sort of unfair attack against the transgender community. What he was asking us to acknowledge, which I think is very fair, is how different minority groups, in this case, Black folks, compared to people in the LGBT community, might get treated differently depending on issues. And he had many jokes and I think very pointed social comments about this, about how Black community issues might be seen as something to just gloss over, while if you offend other communities, it's a very big deal. And I think that those were legitimate points. So I'm on the radio saying, hey, I think Dave Chappelle's saying something worth debating here. Never once saying anything unfair, unnecessarily critical, harsh toward any group of people. But they were so upset that I would even give Dave Chappelle a fair hearing on the radio, that this is the kind of stuff that would wind up in emails to me trying to control the content of my show. And at the end, by Christmas time, just a couple months ago, I said to them, look, I'm not willing to let you control my content. I haven't done anything wrong here. They pulled me off the air and said we would have a meeting to discuss our diversity and inclusion issues. I showed up to that meeting, and instead of being able to talk with the iHeartRadio bosses or the Bell Media bosses, I had a human resources consultant there telling me that there's been a corporate restructuring and my show no longer exists.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
So there's so much there, because I remember you had called me up in January and told me about it, and I wasn't surprised, but I was like taken aback by it, because one of the things is that you used to have me on, and I know you've had other Black conservatives who are Americans as well, but especially when it came to issues like police brutality, a lot of what I said is stuff that the progressive side agrees with. A lot of it, people like myself said, yeah, that was wrong. That was murder. We need to reform the way we do our police. Maybe not defund the police, but yeah, we do need a level of police reform, and we need to change how things are. And I would think that would have resonated with a Canadian audience, even though I may not have gone as far, or you may not have gone as far as they may have wanted. You agreed in principle that there's something wrong here that needs to be fixed. So, I mean, was that an issue for them? Or it sounds like it was more the gender stuff that was making them uncomfortable.
Well, it was also race issues, because another thing I got emailed about from one of my superiors at Bell Media was how we covered vaccine mandates. Now, I have always been of the opinion that you cannot spend all of 2020 telling Black folks and other people of color that the government is against them, systemic racism wants to ruin their lives, the boogeyman is here to end all of your happiness, and then a year later tell them, trust that same government to get a vaccine, and if you don't trust them as quickly as we want you to, we're going to take your job away and we're going to ruin your life. That I thought was unfair, to treat people that way. And I was very vocal about that issue. And that was another one of the things that they were unhappy about. So what I think happens here, Jeff, to your point about police brutality, for instance, is that people who cannot be easily written off as dismissing real issues in our society, like police abuse of power, we are actually more troubling to liberal executives because we are not caricatures. They would love it if we were out here saying the police are perfect, back the blue 100%, because then we get to be the kind of goofball on the air that liberals can dunk on, and they can say, oh, look at these silly conservatives. They are denying what's going on in your community, blah, 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 blah. But when you're more nuanced, and this is where someone like Dave Chappelle becomes threatening, or J.K. Rowling, or even on something like vaccine mandates, people who have more nuanced views that are willing to recognize why people might look at the world differently, than the, let's say, liberal status quo, the establishment view on many of these issues, that becomes troubling to them. Because what they would like to be able to do is caricature their opponents, which frankly is some of my colleagues that they would hire to be on the radio who didn't get fired. They are in many ways say more hyperbolic things than I would ever say. But because they lack nuance, they become these sort of silly guys that you can put out there, and they're not a threat to the liberal narrative. But when you have a guy like yourself on, Jeff, who's going to say, hey, I'm not here to deny that inequality is real. I'm not here to deny that police brutality might be a problem. I just don't think we need the liberal savior solution. That's actually a more threatening way to look at the world for people who want to control what we say, when we say it, and the solutions that we have on the table.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually a point that I've brought up quite a bit too. I mean, I think a lot of people on the left, I would say the far left, maybe not the moderate left, but on the far left, they don't like people like us. Like, they would rather us be what I call Black conservative ink types, where we're just going to deny that inequality exists. We're going to deny that racism exists. We're going to always side with the police. We're going to cheer on Derek Chauvin. Like, that's who they actually want, because
Absolutely.
You're right. That is easier to knock down. That is easier to say to Black people, saying, hey, look what they have going on over there. Do you really want to be associated with people like that? But people like us, it's harder. We're harder to deal with. Now, for the more moderate types, they're okay with it because they want more people talking seriously about these issues. I mean, I've had conversations with Black Democrats here in America who are more of the moderate type, which most are. And, we were able to have these conversations in a way that's sensible. But the bottom line is that progressives don't win over Black people very well. I mean, the vast majority of Black people do not identify as progressive or even liberal. They identify as moderate and conservative. So I can see why they would have a hard time with that. But one thing that you brought up is that in Canada, being a Black male in media, you are expected to parrot those talking points. Can you kind of go? Well, I mean, you kind of already alluded to it, but it's obviously they're pressure. They were trying to press you to be more in the mold that they wanted. But how's the response from your audience, being a Black male who has more conservative views, if the media there is just so saturated with far leftist thought?
Yeah, well, the response is you get enthusiasm on both ends of the spectrum, right? You get a lot of people who are like, wow, like, we don't hear this perspective on the radio or on TV or in newspapers. We're grateful that there's someone saying something different. I get a lot of that reaction, which I'm very grateful for. But I also get a lot of people who are uniquely offended by me, uniquely angry with me, and resentful toward me because they feel like they deserve some sort of ownership over me. And it's something that I feel incredibly frustrated by, right? This idea that if I were an older white guy from another generation, I could have some of these opinions and people would say, okay, well, that's fine because those guys are on their way out. But because I'm younger, I'm Black, I'm supposed to be some sort of window into what the future of our country might look like. Then they feel like they need some control over me. And I get a lot of that reaction. People who just seem to think that, like, they play all sorts of mind games to try to guilt trip you, right? Like, that by having a different opinion, somehow you are betraying your community or putting your community in a more vulnerable position. And I mean, even to your point, even if you represent perhaps the majority of Black people's opinions on something like defund the police, for instance, they still want to convince you that because you are in public life, and when I say they, I mean the far left and some of these liberal executives that control the media in our country, they want to convince someone like me that I'm not supposed to represent the majority of Black people or the will of even a large percentage of our community. They would like to convince me that because I have a platform, I have to handle it a certain way. And that certain way means never dismissing or disagreeing with the far left. I absolutely refuse to do that. And it comes sometimes it comes at a professional cost because it limits some potential places where you might get hired or places where you might be able to do a speech or something like that. But the upside of it is far more worthwhile because you get to actually point out over and over again that these far left activists do not represent the will of the communities that they claim to speak for. And that is irreplaceable. That is invaluable. There's no price on that to me, to be able to poke holes in a narrative that so many people are afraid to contend with.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. So tell me a little bit about, I mean, when they actually let you go, like what was the aftermath of that?
Well, so some of it is just speculation on my part because I don't know everything about what happened there, but a couple of things were clear to me. So first off, the human resources people who fired me, or at least delivered the message, they seemed completely unaware of all the backstory. So I think that there was actually an attempt, both internally and externally, to lie about a restructuring, a corporate restructuring, so that they wouldn't have to acknowledge the real reasons that they let me go. And as I'm sure many people listening to this may say, well, Jamil, how do you know that that happened? Well, partly because the human resources people completely acknowledged. Again, I mean, this happened both in writing and also in a meeting. Acknowledged that they had no idea about all these other things that were going on and all the attempts to control my show and what I would say on the air. But then, so since then, I've just basically started to tell the story of what happened on Substack and been very clear about what I learned about the mainstream media from working there, what I think needs to be done to fix things. And a lot of people wonder, well, how is Jamil able to talk about this? Because if you, in Canada, especially because, just to put into perspective, Jeff, we have in Canada about the same population as California. So we are a fraction of the size of the United States, which means there's very few media companies that have a lot of power and influence in our country. And what people are surprised by is how I'm able to go out and tell the truth about Bell Media and iHeartRadio, and I've not been sued. No one's threatened me with a cease and desist letter. No one's told me that, I've tried to force me to sign an NDA, because the reality is, like, I can prove everything I'm saying. And that's been one of the most interesting things about telling this story and the reaction to it is it's almost like I've helped expose a paper tiger. This company, Bell Media, has scared so many people into silence. They mistreat people in so many ways I won't even go into, and they typically get away with it. No one says anything publicly to expose how political this organization really is. And they make themselves seem like they're this apolitical business just trying to make money. No, they're very, very political. And I've been able to talk about it and without any real recourse because I can prove everything I'm saying, and they know it. I mean, they can see, they have the other side of every email I have, right? So I'm happy to be able to send that message that, a lot of these companies that get away with people being scared of them, you don't always have to be scared. And when the truth is on your side, I would welcome them to challenge me in court if they'd like to dispute anything I've said.
Okay, awesome. So I want to talk more about this, but before I do, just want to remind you guys to remember that libertynation.com is a proud sponsor of A Fresh Perspective. Don't forget to head on over there where you can sign up for the daily briefing and the member zone, all that good stuff. But the main part of it is the cutting-edge conservative news and analysis that you're going to get. It's not going to have all the usual spin that you see from other sites. As a writer for Liberty Nation, I can tell you that we have to write things from a unique angle. We have to put more of our analysis on there. So you're not just going to see the same talking points regurgitated like you do on a lot of other conservative media outlets. You're going to run the full gamut from traditional Republican conservatives. We've got anarchists, libertarians, everything that represents the right. So definitely head on over to libertynation.com where truth is making a comeback. Now, and I don't know how much you can talk about this, Jamil, but I know that you had mentioned that you could possibly be taking legal action against him. Is that still going on, or where does that sit right now?
Yeah, I haven't made a decision about whether I'm going to take legal action yet. In Canadian law, you have quite a bit of time after a situation like this to make that decision. So I'm going to, wait and see. But I'm happy, frankly, that I've taken the approach so far that I have, which is to go public about this because, especially Jeff, I'm sure a lot of your audience probably started paying attention to Canada maybe for the first time ever during the trucker convoy. And it was an important time for people to hear what is happening in these media companies because they were doing everything they could to misrepresent and malign this movement of working and middle class people who were trying to push back on the government's overreach into their lives. So I'm happy with the approach I've taken, but yeah, the legal stuff I haven't made a decision on. And as I said, I'd be happy if they'd like to make the first legal move because I think if they want to challenge anything I've said, I'd be more than welcome to duke it out in the courts.
Well, it doesn't sound like they're going to, honestly. It sounds like they might just be used to getting away with this stuff, honestly. I mean, based on what you're telling me, you're saying that they've mistreated other people. They're used to getting away with it. So they're probably just going to figure, oh, well, he'll say what he has to say and then he'll just go away or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's what they're hoping for too. And I think, ultimately what I think some of these businesses and media companies are probably the biggest offenders in this respect, but I think a lot of other businesses too, and we're seeing this, for example, play out with Ron DeSantis and Disney right now, is a lot of them want to step into the political realm. And I don't think they understand that sometimes they're going to fight with people who are better at politics than they are. And that's what's happened with Bell Media and iHeartRadio. As I said, I went to law school. I worked for Cory Booker. I know politics a lot better than those executives do. And they decide to step into politics and fire me over my political opinions. And they think they're going to get away with it. But you're now in my arena, just like Disney stepped into Ron DeSantis's arena. When you make that move, there are going to be repercussions and consequences that they don't foresee because they are overconfident in their own abilities.
So I know you've been telling your story at least a little bit. I know you waited until later to really start coming out with it. What kind of a response are you getting from Canadians?
Yeah, it's been a lot of different responses. So I think one of the biggest things I've heard from lots of people from different walks of life is almost like, okay, so we thought this kind of stuff was going on, but it's good that we now have an example to prove it. Because I think a lot of people, and this is true for the United States too, when you're watching TV, listening to the radio, reading the newspaper, you have a gut level sense of like there's something not so upfront here, right? There's an agenda at play that a lot of these companies aren't acknowledging. And so I think a lot of people are grateful that through my story, I'm affirming some of their suspicions that there really is a political agenda at play with some of these businesses. I think some of the other responses I've gotten, from let me acknowledge some of the critical responses. Some people have said, "Oh, well, Jamil, this is sour grapes. You lost a radio show. Lots of people lose a radio show. Get over it." Yeah, and what I've said to them is, look, I am a lawyer. I am a writer. I never expected a radio show. I don't feel entitled to one. And if I lost it over legitimate business reasons, like if they said, hey, your ratings are too low, or, we want to change directions, I would understand that. I've moved on from a lot of different jobs and positions throughout my career. But this was clearly a political move. And that's what makes this one frustrating to me. And that's what I've tried to explain to people. I am not trying to make the argument that you can never fire a Black conservative from the radio. I'm not making the argument that I'm entitled to a radio show for as long as I want one. What I'm doing is saying this company fired me for political reasons and lied about it. And if they were willing to come out and acknowledge it and say, look, we don't want this Black conservative on the air anymore because he's saying things we don't like. We don't want people who agree with Dave Chappelle and J.K. Rowling. We don't want people who are going to be hesitant to call their country racist the day before Independence Day. If they would just acknowledge it, then I would have nothing to say. But they don't want to tell the truth. And so a lot of the reaction I've been getting is just trying to help people pay attention to the parts of this that I think are most important. But I definitely would say, Jeff, from Black folks who are on the sort of conservative side of the spectrum, or even just on the center, I think a lot of them are very happy that I've taken this on, because I think, especially in Canada, where we don't have very many Black people in the media, especially Black conservatives in the media. I frankly may be one of the only ones. I think people are happy that there's someone who's pushing back, because too many people, just like in your country, feel like they've been pushed around for so long. And I think they're happy someone's saying, look, you may not agree with me, but you have to contend with my worldview, because people like me exist, and you don't get to pretend or wish away that we're not here in this country.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. When you mentioned that when you started talking about this, that people were saying, we've had a feeling this was going to happen, but now we have evidence. Is there no like conservative media in Canada that would have blasted this out? Because in America, if this would have happened, this would have been headlines on Red State and other sites, and Fox News would probably be covering something like this. People would know that, like we know how the media works here in the United States. It's very biased, and it wouldn't be shocking at all. But it sounds like in Canada, you don't necessarily have that type of conservative media, at least not alternative media.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We don't have a ton of alternative media in Canada. We have a few online platforms that would be considered right-wing. We have some newspapers that would be considered right-wing. But for the most part, we don't have a lot of diversity in our media. It's a lot of the same kind of stuff you would find from CBS and ABC, NBC, sort of left-wing, but pretending it's calling it down the middle. That's a lot of what our media is like.
Mm-hmm.
The other challenge we have is because of the media being so small, and this is one thing that I hope Americans appreciate about sort of the size of their economy and the size of your country, is that because you're big, people can offend one another, and it's not necessarily a career issue. But in Canada, because we're so small, a lot of people don't want to report on my story because they may want to be hired by Bell Media or iHeartRadio one day. And so it creates a bit of it's almost like a country club where they're going to run into each other in the hallway. And so they don't want to offend each other, even when there's a good reason to do so. So, yeah, I mean, to your point, like I've certainly had more coverage of what transpired in my situation from American outlets, The Blaze, Megyn Kelly, different people have talked about it in the US. I haven't gotten nearly as much coverage in Canada for this exact reason.
Wow. Okay. So this kind of leads me to something else that you had talked about. And in one of your Substacks, you talked about the Freedom Convoy and about how we're seeing this trend, and it's going in this direction, I think, in both of our countries, where industries are becoming more siloed. And like you mentioned, that there are going to be two businesses for each political belief in every industry. That's what it seems like it's heading towards. I mean, I saw that with the crowdfunding space, where GoFundMe was essentially trying to steal donations that were meant for the Freedom Convoy. And then they ended up having to refund that. But then Give, Send, Go stepped up and got the money to them. So do you think that there's a solution to this? Because I think it is going in this direction, and I understand why. It's better than the alternative, which would mean just letting the left shut us out of everything. But is there a way to avoid this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think it is a defining question for our generation. You and I are not so different in age. I think we're pretty close. And I think our generation in particular is going to be facing this, because when we get older to the point where we're yielding probably the most purchasing power, it could be in such a polarized environment where we literally do have two businesses for everything, a left-wing and a right-wing grocery store, a left-wing and a right-wing car rental company. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but unfortunately, I think a lot of people want to get us to that point. I would say, I think there are ways we can avoid it. One of them is, through law. And this is a controversial idea for conservatives to consider, because we do, want to allow free enterprise to be as unregulated as it needs to be in order to produce benefits for society. But there are a number of people on the right, including U.S. Senator Marco Rubio, a friend of mine and author Vivek Ramaswamy, Ohio Senate candidate J.D. Vance, people who are raising ideas basically about using government regulation to force corporations and for-profit entities to become less political. And I don't know if that's going to be a growing sentiment in the Republican Party, or in my case, in the Conservative Party of Canada. But I do think that could be one way to avoid this future where everything is so polarized. And essentially what some of these proposals would do is hold corporate officers like CEOs and also corporate board members accountable for using their businesses to promote political agendas that have nothing to do with their actual economic objectives, right? So, I mean, you can think of so many different examples of that, where you've got Amazon, for instance, endorsing Black Lives Matter, or you've got Disney fighting with Ron DeSantis over education policy, or so many different things that you could point to where you could reasonably argue, hey, does this actually have anything to do with you bringing your shareholders the highest profits and returns? So I think that there is an emerging type of public policy discourse that could respond to this problem. But I don't know if anything is going to be, a concrete solution to it. And what I see with someone like Ben Shapiro, for example, and his company, The Daily Wire, which is now getting involved into making movies. And they've got deals with Gina Carano, for instance, and other actors to produce film content. It does seem like there is a real business opportunity for people on the right who want to say, hey, we're going to produce the same product, but we're not going to hate people who, the half of the country who votes against the Democrats. We're not going to hate them in the process of marketing our goods and services. And so where there is a business opportunity, people will go to make that money. And that could be an unavoidable consequence of what's happened with left-wing influence over multinational corporations.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I would be leery about a government solution. I would need to see what that would look like, because I every time I think of the government, I think of the government. Yeah. And when we're in power, we can point that at the other guy. But once they have power over the government, which they will at some point, they can point that right back at us too. I mean, they can argue that certain corporations are too political, but coming from the right, like, Hobby Lobby, Chick-fil-A, stuff like that. But I mean, I would need to see what that would look like. I mean, it's possible, but something's going to have to happen. Otherwise, the future that you and I see is going to happen. I mean, it does sound ridiculous, a separate grocery store for liberals and for conservatives, which that might not happen because you don't know the political beliefs of the people who come into your store. But with other industries where they can do that, it's already happening.
Yeah, so, and I think what's important for us to note here, Jeff, is that this whole polarization of the economy, which could be a consequence of polarized politics, is being threatened on us by fairly moderate positions, right? I mean, we're talking about, like, if you believe that police departments should be funded, if you believe that Dave Chappelle and J.K. Rowling have legitimate points about not erasing women from public discourse and their unique challenges, if you believe that Amazon should not be given essentially a blank check for political power in our country. I mean, these are not issues that would make you so fringe that you should be having to turn to new businesses to get your goods and services met. And yet that is basically what's happening. Like, this division is over issues that are actually quite centrist and moderate in how most people look at them. And yet what we have is people in power who are so far to the left that they're pushing anyone who disagrees with them to the right.
Yeah, it's the fringe that's doing the most damage, in my estimation. So what do you have going on right now? I mean, what's next? Are you going to go back into law? Are you going to have maybe another show, or what are you going to be doing now that you're moving on?
Yeah, well, I've been doing Substack for the last few weeks just because I think it's it's a platform that really lends itself to independence, and I appreciate that, for writing. I have been negotiating with some media companies over the last couple of weeks, so I probably will have a new media deal to announce, in the near future. I've also been talking about, just doing a bit more advocacy on the issues that we've been talking about today, Jeff. Like, to your point, for example, on, not wanting to create government overreach as a solution to corporate overreach. I think that there needs to be some real work on this, because I don't think the solutions to this are very apparent. And I think we have to be very nuanced and careful with how we move forward. So I have been talking to some advocacy groups about starting some projects on this so that we can arrive to some good places, public policy wise, or maybe not public policy, but corporate policy wise.
Right.
And I've been engaging with some business leaders and some policy experts on that. So I think a lot of our conversation today is going to be a roadmap for sort of my next moves professionally. But I'm still a few weeks away from announcing anything concrete.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. I mean, well, I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about this, especially depending on what your next move is. But why don't you tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Jamil Jivani, JamilJivani. And you can also find me at jamiljivani.substack.com. You can subscribe for free, or you can chip in for a paid subscription. And that's been a great way to really engage with people who are concerned about these issues over on Substack.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks for joining me, and then we'll be linking up again soon.
Yeah, it's so weird to not be the one asking you questions, but I appreciate the conversation, Jeff. Thanks, man.
Hey.